All states in the world, large or small, are cities of heaven, and all people, young or old, honorable or humble, are its subjects. Mosey. Welcome to this week's episode of Warfare, Advancement, and Revisionism. My name is Preston Floyd, and as always, I am your host. I'd like to thank everyone for coming in and listening this week, and if this is your first time, welcome. I hope you enjoy. Please feel free to go back and listen to our back catalog, and if you are a continuing listener, welcome back. So, probably going to be a little bit shorter of an episode this week, at least definitely compared to last week's, but we had a lot to cover then, and we still have a little bit to cover now. So, without too much ado, I am going to go ahead and dive into the kind of culmination of our talk about East Asia, but there is one thing I did forget to mention last week, and I wanted to kind of bring it up for this week. When talking about Jihao, which was one of the Peilagong sites, or possibly its own culture, again, that's one of those things debated, that they did find residue for the oldest found alcoholic beverage that could be chemically analyzed and broken down. Basically, they could see what the recipe was. At least that was true as of 2017. I believe the porridge and beer found at Göbekli Tepe was analyzed and proved in, I think, 2021. But again, Jihao was the oldest first, and it may still be the only one that they have the exact kind of breakdown for. But the Jihao brew was a mix of rice, wild grapes, honey, and hawthorn. And I'll talk about some of those ingredients when we get to our domestication episode, specifically grapes. China isn't particularly known for grape wine, at least in the past and into the modern day. And part of that is due to the nature of their grapes. They grow a little bit better at higher altitudes. And for whatever reason, the taste in China tended to be a little bit closer to things like plum wine and things like that. But that stuff we'll dive into in the future episodes, so just wanted to bring that up. But for now, though, I want to kind of talk about who the Neolithic populations of Southeast Asia and East Asia were, and how they relate to modern people living in the area. And a lot of this is going to be based on some new DNA studies by Melinda Yang out of the University of Richmond in Virginia, and her article, which is A Genetic History of Migration, Diversification, and Admixture in Asia. And this was published in January of 2022. So you are free to look it up on your own. It's a very interesting article, very deep dive, and it even covers places that we have talked about and will talk about that are kind of outside of East Asia, and we'll get into that here shortly. And as always, when we talk about DNA, please bear in mind that future surveys and discoveries may drastically change some of this. The study itself is built off of earlier work done in, I think, 2010, 2011. But before we continue, I do want to go ahead and give another refresher about haplogroups. A haplogroup is a population of humans who share a common ancestor. Now, I understand that's a very broad term, but when discussing human migrations and stuff like that, there are two types of large haplogroups that are studied. The first is the mitochondrial DNA haplogroups, which trace female ancestry, and Y chromosome DNA haplogroups, which trace male ancestry. These groups are all lettered and numbered to keep track of what population is where, when, and whom they descended from. And though they're usually kind of referred to as the last common ancestor, they actually contain all prior ancestors in the result, or at least all prior common ancestors in the result. So again, just think of this as a DNA test for a population rather than individuals. To go back to one of our very first episodes, in fact it may have been our first one, we have mitochondrial Eve. She is referred to as L1. Her female descendants, who became the last common female ancestors of the various African groups, were labeled as L1 through L6. And L3 is the last common female ancestor for everyone who left Africa. Now, there are cases where descendants of one of these groups later intermarry at a large scale with descendants of another group, and this can cause confusion that has to be worked out by comparing, as many additional DNA sources as we can find, and archaeology, things like that. But as time has gone on, things generally get clearer and probably will continue to do so. Now, let's get back to the people living in mainland Southeast Asia at our timeline. And of course, they are descendants of the initial migrants into the region. And this initial group moved into Southeast Asia and then eventually split into a number of subgroups that moved to the north. Probably due to the Austro-Asian populations already occupying, the islands to the south. The people that would eventually become the Aboriginal peoples in Australia and Papua New Guinea and places like that. Now, there are those that remain in this area and occupy what is now, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, mainland Malaysia. And the Hawabenhian are descendants of this group. And you can go back a couple episodes and refresh yourself on them. So they are generally staying in this initial area. Now, you also have a group that Yang refers to as Guangxi ancestry. And Guangxi is the coastal province of China bordering Vietnam. Now, this population was found by an individual, or its DNA was found in an individual who lived around 8500 BCE and continues to exist in this general region, and hunter-gatherers living in the region as late as 4000 BCE. We know that because sets of remains have been found dating to those periods. And then there are no other DNA sources, at least that have been found, occupying that region. Now, no remains after 4000 BCE have share that ancestry. In fact, no populations living in the region today or neighboring ones have been found that are at least direct descendants of these people. What caused this to happen, we will dive into. I think next season we'll probably get into speculation on that. But just keep in mind that, it's hard to say exactly what happened, but it is something we will try to suss out, I guess, for lack of a better term. Now, another ancestral population to discuss is the Fujian ancestral population. They're occupying modern Fujian and Taiwan. They will make up a large portion of modern Polynesian ancestry, or it might be more accurate to say that the modern people kind of in Polynesia and those areas will be a mix of Fujian ancestry and another lineage that Yang refers to as Australasian lineage. And this refers to kind of the peoples who primarily contributed to well, let me rephrase. So there's the Australasians. They, contribute to populating the South Pacific Ocean, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, places like that. And of course, Aboriginal Australians. But, of course, the areas where the Fujian and the Australasians overlap are, different from where, the Aboriginal peoples in Australia end up. So you kind of have to take DNA from modern populations to know, what percentage they bear from what side of their ancestry. So basically, not everyone that has Australasian lineage will have Fujian, but everyone who has Fujian ancestry will probably have some level of Australasian ancestry, at least in areas they colonized. Their homelands, probably not, just because they'll have other ancestry mixed in, especially in places like Fujian and Taiwan. But we'll dive into that a little bit more specifics, of course, at a later date. Next up, we have the Tibetan group. Now, the individuals tested to establish this ancestry don't actually appear in the archaeological region, or in the archaeological record in that region until about 1000 BC. And we know that peoples were living there far earlier than that, though in, again, small numbers, or at least comparatively small numbers to other regions. So the tested individuals were from a separate population to the west of the next group that we will talk about. And that's the Yellow River Ancestry Group. And there's no doubt in my mind, and I think even in the results itself, that the Tibetan group and the Yellow River Ancestry Group had strong connections to each other. Though, given what we know about Tibet's topography and ability to support larger populations, I imagine that they were under pressure from their neighbors. In addition to having, positive contacts, they probably had some rough connections as well. But again, that's more for us to talk about in the future. Then we have what is known as the Amur River Ancestry Group. These peoples are tightly linked to ancestors of some northern Chinese peoples, but also the various steppe nomads of the Far East, like Mongols, Jurchens, things like that. But, or I should say peoples like that. But the Yellow and Amur River peoples are also a mix of populations from the north and west that we will be talking about more in the next set of episodes. So, for what is now modern China and the rest of Southeast Asia, we have essentially five primary groups. There's the Tibetan, there's the Yellow River group, there's the Guangxi, the Fujian, and the Halbanian in Southeast Asia, minus Burma. And for that, of course, Burma might not have been very highly populated, or at least does not show up in these genetic studies. So, so we have those four large groups. And in the future, that we'll get to kind of when we start next season, we will have essentially four major language families occupying these areas. Now, it's important to keep in mind that these families are highly debated, and I'll go into that in just a moment. But it's not to say that there are not other language families, even in the region today. Their languages just might not be well documented enough to kind of classify, and it's also possible and more than likely that there are some language families that are in this area that just did not survive to the modern day. So please keep this in mind. This is an incomplete list. I cannot stress that enough. And I don't know why I said list like that, but so you have the Sino-Tibetan language family. You have the Kra-Dai language family. Then you also have the Hmong-Mien language family, and of course the Austronesian language family. Now, depending on who you ask, these are all one super family. A lot of Chinese linguists, and indeed other linguists too, not just Chinese. A lot of Western linguists at one point or another did kind of classify them all as one large family. However, since I think the 1940s, a lot of other explanations have been put forward for some of these families. So China is kind of trying to hold on to this idea of a larger, genetic relationship between themselves and all of their peoples. And there is some, we just talked about it. There are 4 broad DNA groups that in China specifically, there has been generations of intermixing. It's not to say there's not. It's just that, their idea of their language family is a little skewed, or at least that's the popular consensus. Maybe they're right, but I know most linguists do not agree that they are all together anymore. But yeah, so you have these 4 large families, and they don't 100% line up with the regions kind of put forward by Yang's DNA study. Though it's pretty close. It is pretty close. Now, for when these language families emerge, again, highly debated. But I believe the Sino-Tibetan language family is considered to be the oldest. And I think there are some who claim it could be as old as 6,500 to 6,000, possibly a little older, possibly slightly younger. It's hard to say. But I think most people I've read have the Sino-Tibetan family emerging sometime around 5,000 BC. So it's something that's going to kind of emerge there. Kra-Dai and Hmong-Mien, on the other hand, these do not emerge until much later. What they replaced in those regions, it's hard to kind of hard to speculate on. We don't have much in the way of obviously written records to compare, and then other people's who write down these other words. As we've discussed, Chinese lends itself to kind of overwriting these things with kind of those semantic things we talked about when it comes to things like place names or like hacker, haike. And again, that's not something that's unique to Chinese. It just helps because of their writing system that they have a lot of options to be able to do this. But yeah, so just keep all this in mind. But it would not surprise me if that these the 3 non-Sino-Tibetan language families, if they did not replace some earlier set of languages. Kra-Dai obviously came from somewhere. Hmong-Mien came from somewhere, and then Austronesian came from somewhere. Now, you may ask, well, why does a language family emerge? Why do languages diverge over time? And, that is obviously a very deep question, and it is something that has been debated quite quite a lot for quite a while. It is, obviously one of the key founding cornerstones of the entire discipline of linguistics. It is truly hard to say, and I know that's probably not satisfying, but I think we can make some reasonable guesses. Though keep in mind, my guesses come from a kind of a historian's background, not necessarily a actual linguistic background. But it's important to remember that through most of our history, humans have lived in very small groups. Again, most of the time you wouldn't have more than 20 people around you, people you know, family, things like that. You would, of course, have periods where you would meet up with extended families, and your numbers jump from 20, 25 people to 100, maybe 150 people. It's easy when you're doing this to kind of keep your language simple, and of course, any changes that happen to your language over time are probably small and, of course, fairly universal. You're not seeing things that are out of the ordinary to yourself or to your immediate family that you don't have words for. And if you do find something new or create something new or experience something new, your word would quickly spread through to your family or your extended family, your clan or tribe or whatever you want to call it. Now, as we begin to settle down and form larger societies, it's harder to keep track of things like that. There is a theory that a human can't keep track of more than 150 people. That's the actual absolute maximum size that a single individual can keep track of on a deep, personal, meaningful level. And then after that, you kind of lose track. That's why people think, one of the reasons why people think more advanced language and record keeping abilities evolve, like why we came up with things for writing, because you don't just have 150 people you're keeping track of. You're probably having 4 times that at the very minimum, and then of course you're having to keep track of all of these people's things as well. So not just whatever they're creating, but whatever they're consuming, whatever they are doing. So that's one of the reasons that you probably see these more sophisticated, or at least more complicated family or languages emerge. So just keep this in mind. And this is a process that's beginning to happen not just in China, but also in India, as well as the Middle East and parts of Africa. These are all going to really kind of kick off as these larger groups kind of begin to coalesce. So that is something that is going to take place essentially for the rest of our show here. And it has, again, been happening or will be happening as we go forward. The reason I'm bringing it up now is because there's a lot of different groups in China. China is a huge place. It's very diverse. And that's not something that, at least in the West, that we really think when we talk about this region. And there are, people who don't realize just how large China is and how, again, diverse, because, for whatever reason, some you can probably imagine, people don't necessarily look at Chinese people and understand why they're different, and they don't hear the differences in their language. And I will say, for something like Mandarin, that is a language that's very widespread, but it's also not something that has happened organically. There's been a very large push through Chinese history to, of course, standardize their language and their writing and things like that. So, that's something that will come into play and something we'll talk about. There's a lot of types of control exerted on the Chinese language that you maybe don't see in too many other places. There are some that would definitely give the Chinese state a run for its money when controlling their speech systematically or centrally, as opposed to letting it evolve organically. But as we'll see, that's not the exact easiest thing to do, and there are always unintended changes or consequences of these types of actions. So that is something that we'll continue to dive into as we get to this region in future seasons. However, I do want to kind of go over some of the big theories when it comes to the Sino-Tibetan languages, because again, it's very possible that this process is starting as we're kind of ending our season in this region. So, there are kind of right now, I believe, 3 popularly held theories about how Sino-Tibetan emerged. There is one put forward by, I believe the name is Sargert, and he's not the only one. This is actually a group, but he's the name that I remember reading in the note for it. And this has been put forward in around 2019, I think, is when the last time they published, or at least the time it was published initially. So it was Sargert et al. Dated language oh God, pardon my pause here, people. Dated language philologies shed light on the ancestry of Sino-Tibetan. Now, his theory, or I should say their theory, because Sargert is a woman, excuse me. I believe it's a woman. It's either, I think it was Lauren Sargert when I read the actual document. I should have pulled it up. But so essentially, this group kind of holds the theory that that the Sino-Tibetan language evolves right along the Yellow River, probably from the late Xishan cultures, or possibly the immediate successor to the Xishan, which again we'll talk about later. But this group quickly spreads out to the west and then to the south of the Yellow River basin. So they kind of go upriver, get to the plateau, the mountains, and then they spread down through the Shangjiang or the Yangtze, and then they continue to go down these various river valleys. And then from there, you kind of develop Tibetan. Burmese comes along from that initial kind of break away from the Tibetan, and then you go from there. The next kind of hypothesis I need to speak about is the one. It's the one. This one's from 2005. It was proposed by, believe, Von Driem was the name. I think that's what. I have terrible handwriting. I believe it is Von Driem is the name. Now, this proposes that there was kind of a central Mesolithic or late Stone Age, Neolithic type group, and that they were located in kind of the region where the Chongjiang or the Yangtze meets the Tibetan Plateau. And then you have various groups move out from there. So it's the homeland where you have this kind of central Sichuan, essentially. That's the area of China it is. And then you have a group that goes to the north east, and that's the Peligong Xishan culture. You have a group that goes to the north, and that has the another set, and that will eventually become the Tibetan languages. Then you have a group that goes to the south west, and these will be the people that occupy Nepal and Bhutan. And of course, they'll continue interacting with the Tibetans. And then you have a group that leaves and goes to the south and south east, and they'll of course go to Burma, and they'll get to the kind of the Shan foothills. And again, that kind of ties into some of those languages in those areas being tied to Sino-Tibetan, and we'll go into that there in a little bit. And then finally, we have one that was proposed in 2009 by Blinch, and essentially he argues that there is just a single kind of group in what is now Bhutan, right on the southern edge of the Tibetan plateau, and then they move north into the Tibetan plateau, and then from there they spread out in form the Sinitic languages. And of course, the other language families like Hongmian, they come from this early Tibetan migration, and he also proposes that there are, I guess, relatives, you would say, of this Bhutan group who were occupying what is now modern-day Bangladesh and Burma, and that they're the ones who spread those languages in the south. So they're not actually directly related to the Tibetan part there, but they're sister or brother languages of Tibetan, and they kind of keep that close contact and share words and things like that. Whereas the Hmong-Mien and the Sinitic speakers kind of develop a more kind of a close relationship as they move in. And of course, the Sinitic speakers are also influenced by the Altaic, which is not one of the languages we're going to dive into in this episode, but that's one kind of in the or there's one that's kind of proposed to have existed in the Mongol steppes and places like that. Now, which of these do I guess most closely buy? Personally, I favor the von Driem hypothesis. And the reason for that is it takes into account the greater diversity in the Sino-Tibetan branch. You'll find it actually kind of in what is now kind of that far south, southwest of China in the Sichuan area. There's a lot of just small languages along that kind of area. So I think it probably developed somewhere where the, I guess the headwaters of the Yangtze or Xinjiang kind of begins to fall from the Tibetan plateau. And then it spread out from there. Not just to the Xinjiang area, but also the Yellow River's head. Because they kind of, there's a gap where they form, but they both form along the Tibetan plateau where it meets kind of, I guess, what you consider the more flatter or slightly less elevated areas of China. So I do think that that's a perfect home region, right there on that plateau, right around Sichuan or what's the province? Yunnan, Sichuan, Yunnan area. That's a perfect place for for a bunch of languages to pop up from a single source because of all the valleys and hills and rivers and lakes, that kind of thing. There's a lot of isolation you can have, which would help the development of these languages. And then you probably wouldn't see them become radically different until they started living radically different lifestyles. That's another thing that you need to take into effect. People don't necessarily have the or they may keep the same words for simple things like axe or arrow or bow. It wouldn't change too much for those things because they're something everyone would have. They have this common frame of reference. But then as you move out of this kind of home region, you start developing agriculture. You start having to keep track of days in larger numbers. You develop these things slowly over time. But honestly, just because I favor the von Driem, explanation, does not mean I think it is that much more accurate. I just think it's the one that makes the most sense to me based on what my understanding of linguistics is and how, they develop over time. I doubt that any of these theories are 100% correct. I'm sure that there's been stuff that's been misclassified or misattributed. And again, there's a huge gap in the archaeological record in China, which is something that they are working on. They are, constantly, finding new things there because they have been paying closer attention to their distant past. So this is one of those areas I feel like we're going to see a lot of changes in the record as time goes on. So, but yeah, that's kind of what my opinions are on that. We will, of course, talk about these other languages and how they're developing. I think in the next season, at least for the Austronesian and the Kra Dai, I think it is up to debate on the Hmong Mien. That one actually doesn't show up until much later. But I do think there's a lot of stuff that we have to look forward to for this next season in this region. So I hope you all can keep track and remember, and if not, I hope you come back and re-listen to these episodes. But yeah, so I think that's kind of a good point. This episode's way longer than I thought it was going to be, mainly to me rambling. I hope I made sense. I hope my thoughts were calm and collected, and I didn't confuse you in what I was trying to say. But yeah, next week we will talk about Korea, Japan, and probably get into the Far Eastern Steppes to talk about the peoples living there. And then we'll, of course, go back closer to the Urals, which is, of course, is the barrier between Europe and Asia. And then, we'll swing by and hit the Australia and talk about the Aboriginal people there at this point in time. Then we'll talk about Europe and get to the Americas. So we're getting close to capping out season 3 here. But if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to let me know. You can reach me directly at waradrevpod@gmail.com. I had a very nice email last week, and I hope I answered your question. I didn't ask permission to say the name, so I won't. But you can also reach me via direct message at Twitter, which I will include the link to the Twitter account. You can also comment on my YouTube channel. Any video, feel free. I have been also playing Far Cry Primal on YouTube live. And of course, you can go back and watch old episodes. But on the new episode, if you come while I'm playing, you can feel free to drop in the chat and ask a question there. But yeah. Thank you all for tuning in. I hope you have a good rest of your day and a good rest of your week. Thank you all. Goodbye.